Energy was a mechanic introduced back in the Kaladesh block. This mechanic quickly proved to be exceptionally powerful, though fairly controversial in the community. Most people in the community look back on this mechanic with ire. So today, we're going to explore exactly why this design failed. Now, this is technically a failed MTG mechanics video, but since the mechanic was actually very strong, we decided to change the name to reflect that fact. Onto the mechanic itself. Energy was basically an additional resource mechanic. Cards would generate energy, which would simply give you, the player, a number of counters. Then you could later spend this energy for various effects. Most cards that generated energy also used energy, but there were cards that gave you energy without asking for any. Energy was also very common in the set, with around 70 cards that had energy on them somewhere in their card text. We already mentioned that energy was one of, if not the best deck at times in its standard format, to the point where it required bans to rein in. The specific deck that ended up being too good was called Temur Energy. Temur is the community name for the green-blue-red color combination, named after a clan on the plane of Tekir in the same name. Considering how strong this deck was, it only makes sense to go over the prime suspects as to cards that made energy such an infamous mechanic. Aether Hub is a land that gives you energy when it enters the battlefield. You can tap it to add a colorless mana, or you can tap it and pay 1 energy to add 1 mana of any color. Aether Hub was just an incredible source of mana fixing for the deck. The mana was so good the deck was able to splash a 4th color at multiple points in its lifespan to allow it to play some powerful tech options, or simply play some cards that were too good not to splash for. The other card that made the deck so good on mana was Attune with Aether. This is a sorcery that mana cost of 1 green. It has the effect where you search your library for a basic land card, put it into your hand, shuffle, and get 2 energy. Attune allowed you to search for your 1 of basic lands if you didn't draw one of your Aether Hubs, or one of your Servants of Conduit to filter for mana. This gives you a total of 12 cards that give you mana of any color, which allows you to play a 3 or 3.5 color deck without getting punished at all. This was also the only 1 mana spell in the deck, as the deck just didn't have any other good 1-drops to play. Attune would eventually get banned or rein the deck's power level by hurting its consistency. On top of the great mana fixing, the deck had great threats. Longtusk Cub was a 2/2 for 1 and 1 green that gives you 2 energy when it deals combat damage to a player, and lets you pay 2 energy to give it a +1/+1 counter. Cub was a great scaling threat that gave the deck far better early game power. Roller Virtuoso is a 2/3 for 1 blue and 1 red. It gives you 3 energy when it enters the battlefield, and allows you to pay 3 energy to make a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token with flying. Virtuoso was a great way both to get a lot of energy and to go wide against decks that relied on single target removal, which was made even better by the tokens having flying. It also just let the deck make a ton of chump blockers if they were in a pinch. Bristling Hydra is a 3/2 for 2 and 2 green that gave you 3 energy when it entered the battlefield, and had the ability where you could pay 3 energy to give it a +1/+1 counter and have it gain hexproof until the end of turn. Hexproof made it so that your opponent couldn't target it with spells or abilities. Hydra basically required a board wipe to answer, as the deck would always have far too much energy for you to run them out of energy and actually resolve a removal spell. The deck also had an amazing removal spell in Harness Lightning, an instant for 1 and 1 red with the effect where you choose a target creature. You gain 3 energy, then you pay any amount of energy and deal that much damage to the chosen creature. Lightning allowed the deck to answer creatures of any size by paying enough energy, which a lot of red decks couldn't do. The other card that got banned from the deck was Rogue Refiner, a 3/2 for 1 green and 1 blue that has the ability to let you draw a card and give you 2 energy when it enters the battlefield. This card was also mostly banned to lower the deck's consistency, as the cycle and extra energy the card gave you allowed you to do what you wanted far more consistently. These cards were the backbone of the Temur Energy deck, but there were tons of other energy cards that were notable. Another card that got banned was Aetherworks Marvel. This was a legendary artifact with a mana cost of 4. It has the abilities where, whenever a permanent was put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you get an energy. And then you can pay 6 energy and tap to look at the top 6 cards of your library. You can cast a card from among them without paying its mana costs, but you put the rest on the bottom of your library. This card was mostly used to cheat out incredibly powerful cards like Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger and Emrakul the Promised End. This card was actually mostly banned for being uncompetitive rather than being too good. While the deck could fairly consistently spin the Marvel on turn 4, if you didn't spin into a big hit, the deck would often just fold to the powerful aggro decks in that standard or even the Temur Energy with more aggressive draw power. However, if they did hit one of their giant tentacle monsters, you would often just lose on the spot. The deck was inconsistent enough that most of the good decks still had a winning matchup against it, but losing random games to a deck where you didn't have much meaningful counterplay was just not fun, so the card was banned. Now that we've gone over all, or at least a majority of the really strong energy cards, let's talk about the problems with the mechanic. Unlike a lot of the other mechanics we've covered in the series, the mechanic doesn't have any flaws that kill it outright. But rather, it has a lot of design challenges, and it unfortunately fell prey to quite a few of them. The first major issue was how parasitic the mechanic was. Parasitism is a design term wizards use to refer to mechanics that don't work super well with other mechanics. For example, the Outlast mechanic isn't very parasitic. This is a mechanic where you could pay a cost and tap a creature with Outlast to put a +1/+1 counter on the creature, but only as a sorcery. The Outlast mechanic was actually a lot worse at energy, but it wasn't parasitic because it works with a ton of other mechanics in Magic. +1/+1 counters are a very common theme that a lot of other mechanics care about. Energy, on the other hand, is very hard for other mechanics to interact with. There are very few mechanics that interact with players getting counters. The only one that can really interact favorably with it is Proliferate, which works with any mechanic focused on counters, including things like Outlast. Energy doesn't work with things outside of other energy cards, which has you run into a few issues. The main one is that the mechanic never really gets any better. This is why, despite being one of the best standard decks ever with one of the most dominant runs in its format, only being held back by Remnant Red being a similarly broken deck, the deck has seen no success in any non-rotating format. The mechanic has, in the several years since its printing, not gotten any support, and has only gotten further and further away from being playable in older formats. This is the issue with parasitic mechanics. They only ever get to see play in Standard, which makes them a lot less interesting to players. This leads well into the second design challenge, and one that every mechanic faces: game balance. All mechanics need to be both strong enough to be playable, but not too strong as to break a format. And with energy, Wizards aimed far too high. This is mostly due to the final two design challenges the mechanic faces, the one that makes it hardest to design for. Energy both is impossible to interact with and is extremely versatile. In terms of interacting with energy, you simply can't do anything to stop your opponent from getting energy outside of trying to prevent them from playing their cards at all. The only ways to do this are to counter their spells or make them discard all their cards. This is an issue not only because only 2 colors get access to these effects, but also because it's just not practical. Once your opponent gets energy, they're going to keep it. There are a couple of cards that were printed in this standard that could prevent energy gains, such as Solemnity, which prevents players, artifacts, creatures, lands, and enchantments from getting counters. Sun Cleanser could also be used to remove all counters from a creature to a player and stop additional counters from being placed there. Both of these cards unfortunately weren't enough to stop energy, as they were too clunky and slow on top of coming to a format very late into rotation. Being hard to interact with was an issue, but the versatility is something hard to put into words until you play with the deck. If most of the energy cards are designed around the idea that they were the only energy card in your deck, they'd just be okay. Roller Virtuoso could be a 2/3 that makes you 1/1 flyer for just 3 mana, and it would be fair. Long Tusk Cub could be a 2 mana 2/2 that gets a +1/+1 counter when it deals combat damage to an opponent and be fine. What makes them good is being able to use energy from cards like Attune with Aether and use the energy on them instead. Long Tusk Cub could be used to push for a ton of damage extremely quickly by dumping all of your energy into it, quickly becoming a 7/7 or bigger. A common play was using Harness Lightning to make 3 energy and not doing any damage with it, just spending it to save for your Bristling Hydra or making another token off of Virtuoso. None of these uses alone are broken, but it allows the pilot to use all the resources in the most effective way possible. This not only made energy very powerful, it made it a deck with a fairly high skill ceiling, and one that was rather fun to play. This is one of the more interesting things about the mechanic. Players will often look back on the deck unfavorably, talk about how hard it is to interact with and how parasitic it was. But despite all these pitfalls, the deck had a kernel of a good idea in it. Being able to stockpile a resource and spend it however you want throughout the entire game is just a fun idea for a mechanic. And if it was balanced correctly, it would probably have been remembered fondly. The problem is, well, besides being a parasitic as we mentioned earlier, is that this versatility makes judging the power level of the mechanic really hard. None of the energy cards are, on their own, broken. It's the entire package that's so good. It's the synergy, quite literally the deck being more than the sum of its parts. This is why when Wizards went back after the deck, they banned Attune with Aether and Rogue Refiner. None of the individual pieces of the deck were a problem. Each of the deck's threats and spells were mostly fine on their own. It was the ability of the deck to pivot into whatever strategy happened to be best against each opponent that made it so good. Hitting these energy producers made the deck worse at generating tons of energy to spend on whatever they needed, while also reducing the consistency of the deck. Attune was mostly hit to restrict the deck's color fixing, as being able to splash whatever colors they needed made the deck far too hard to counter. And Rogue Refiner was a card that just made all the other cards around it far better. You couldn't really interact with it favorably, as the extra energy and card draw was too much to give them by using a removal spell on it. However, it was a big enough body to threaten your opponent's life or their planeswalkers. Banning these 2 cards really shows how the energy mechanic really just needed an overall power down rather than individual cards being too broken. Now, in many ways, energy is actually an improved version of a previous mechanic. Specifically, charge counters. This is a mechanic that's shown up all over the place throughout Magic's history, and if you look at it, you can kinda see how energy is a new take on this old mechanic. Charge counters are counters that can be placed on a permanent, usually by its own abilities, and don't do anything on their own. They instead are checked for by other abilities to do, well, basically anything. Chalice of the Void checks how many charge counters it has to determine what spells it counters. Magistrate's Scepter asks you to remove 3 charge counters from it to take an extra turn, but costs 4 mana and tap in it to put a charge counter on it. These 2 uses are the main way that charge counters are deployed, and how they're used currently. However, in Mirrored in Block, Wizards decided to make this less of a one-off design and more of an archetype, and it failed hard. Cards like Core Tapper were designed to give cards more charge counters so you could use their abilities more often, and this didn't really work. The main issue was that your opponent could far too easily remove the cards you were putting all those counters on, leaving all the work you've done go to waste. Combine this with the fact that, to keep these cards balanced, they had to be worse up front, and you have a mechanic that just didn't really work. However, if you think about it, using Core Tapper to charge up your Magistrate's Scepter is very similar to using a 2 with Aether to charge up your Long Tusk Cup. Energy is basically just charge counters, but with all the charge counters on you instead of your permanents. This simultaneously creates and solves a big problem. It does make the cards a lot better against removal. However, it also removes basically all ways for your opponent to interact with your game plan. What we need is a middle ground, where interactions don't completely blow you out, but your opponent can still do something about all the counters you're building up. Now, there are a few ways you could try to fix energy mechanic at a design level. First is actually just printing way more of it. This may sound strange, but energy as a mechanic was meant to be a specific deck archetype instead of a fundamental resource that every deck was going to use. If you did design it as a mechanic that every deck would be used in different ways, then the mechanic wouldn't be as problematic. In fact, there were a few decks that weren't as good as Temur Energy, but were still based around it. Dynavolt Tower control decks popped up here and there during that standard. Tower is an artifact that costs 3 mana and has the abilities where, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get 2 energy. And you can tap in and pay 5 energy to deal 3 damage to any target. These decks played almost none of the same cards as Temur Energy, using Tower and Glimmer of Genius to produce basically all their energy, and using Tower to zap down threats and eventually win the game. If you were to print more cards like this that give you energy for doing specific things with an appropriate payoff, you'd have energy being a more interesting mechanic to build around. Rather than just playing all the best cards that say you gain energy like people did, you'd have people building around specific cards while leaning on some of the same staples as they do now. However, this has a different issue, which is, of course, that this requires printing a ton of more energy cards. It would fundamentally change the game, and that's not something to do lightly. This would also mean that the issue of being unable to interact with the mechanic would be more entrenched into the game, so you'd have to print more cards to deal with that alongside these cards. The other way to fix the mechanic would be building a way to interact with the energy counters more easily into the mechanic. One suggestion has been making it so that, whenever you deal damage to your opponent, you can instead make them lose that much energy instead of losing the life. This would give basically every deck a way to answer the energy decks that were stockpiling up outside of playing very specific answers. However, this would probably require the entire mechanic to be rebalanced, so we'd have to wait for the next time Wizards rolled a mechanic like this out. All in all, energy gets a bit of a bad rap. The mechanic had slightly more legs than a lot of players give it credit for, and the failure of the mechanic was mostly just a failure to balance it properly. The mechanic was interesting to play with as it gave you a lot of freedom, but this freedom was ultimately what made the deck too strong, alongside the fact that there wasn't any practical way for your opponent to interact with energy counters. If Wizards ever want to revisit the mechanic, they may be able to get it to work, but it's going to take some work. Alright, and that's the video. If you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, please let us know down in the comments below.